So you're standing outside the boardroom, and your hand is hovering just an inch or two over the cold metal of the doorknob. Inside that room, the entire executive team is just sitting there waiting for your presentation. And suddenly, your mouth goes completely dry.
Oh, yeah, cottonmouth.
Right. And your heart is just hammering against your ribs so hard you can actually feel the vibration in your teeth. Your palms are slick with sweat. Your breathing gets incredibly shallow, and your stomach is tying itself into these incredibly tight knots. And you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, you aren't being chased by a hungry predator,
That's
right?
it, fun and high.
You're not facing a physical attack. You're literally just about to walk into a climate-controlled room and show other human beings a slide deck. So why is your body preparing for mortal combat?
It's fascinating because that physical reaction is actually one of the most profound evolutionary hangovers that human beings possess. We're basically walking around with this ancient biological hardware that was, specifically designed to keep us alive on the savannah. And we're trying to use that exact same hardware to navigate the modern corporate workplace, or, a university lecture hall, or even just a difficult conversation with a partner. But the real mystery, the one that has actually captivated neuroscientists for decades now, isn't just why we have that stress response.
Right.
It's why that response looks so radically different from one person to the next.
Which is exactly why we're here today. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission for this discussion is, well, it's massive, and I think it's going to completely change how you view your own physical reactions. Because we're going to unpack the intense, behind-the-scenes psychology and neuroscience of how our brains and our bodies actually process stressful situations.
Because look, we've all experienced that sweaty palm moment.
Exactly, every single one of us. But here is the multi-million-dollar question. Why do some people walk into that boardroom or, step up to that podium and just thrive? Like they deliver a flawless performance, their voice is steady, their mind is sharp, while other people under that exact same pressure completely freeze, forget their own presentation, and just shut down.
Yeah, for a very long time, society's answer to that question was incredibly unhelpful. We just called it mental toughness.
Right, grit, just power through it.
Exactly. We just assumed some people were born with more grit or better nerves. But the reality is far more mechanistic than that. The difference between thriving and freezing under pressure is not some vague, mystical concept of willpower. It's actually a highly measurable cascade of structural changes in the brain. We're talking massive shifts in network connectivity and regional brain activations.
The biological.
Entirely. When you're standing outside that door, your brain is literally rewiring its communication pathways in real time, based entirely on a subconscious calculation it's making about the room on the other side.
And I think the most empowering part of the research we're diving into today is that this calculation isn't locked in stone. You are not a victim of your biology. We have an incredible stack of sources today. We're talking pivotal papers from journals like Science, Molecular Psychiatry, and Psychological Science.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, the real heavy hitters. And I want to make a promise to you, the listener. By the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand the exact biological mechanisms of stress. You're going to know how your brain shifts its resources, but much more importantly, you're going to learn how to hack your own brain's appraisal system.
Yeah, you can literally force your biology to turn stress from a debilitating force into basically a performance-enhancing drug.
I love that. But to get to those interventions, we first have to understand the foundational architecture, right? Like, what is the stress response built on?
Right. We need to look at what scientists call the biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat. Because the body's reaction to stress isn't just a single uniform event. It actually splits down two entirely different physiological pathways.
Okay, let's unpack that split. So, are you challenged or are you threatened? The foundational work here goes back to researchers like Tomaka and Blaskovich in the late 90s, and it was beautifully expanded upon by Jeremy Jameson and his colleagues around 2012.
Yeah.
And they established that our response to a stressful situation is dictated by this lightning-fast equation happening deep in our subconscious.
Think of it like a scale. On one side of the scale, your brain is piling up the perceived demands of the situation. So how difficult is this task? How much danger am I in? How much uncertainty is there?
Is the audience hostile? That kind of thing.
Exactly. How much physical or mental effort is this going to require? It's weighing the totality of what the environment is actively asking of you.
Okay, so that's the demand side. And on the other side of the scale?
On the other side, the brain is piling up your perceived resources. Do I have the skills to handle this? Have I practiced this presentation enough?
Do I have my team backing me up?
Right. Or even, have I survived something similar to this in the past? In just a fraction of a second, the brain weighs demands against resources, and whichever side of the scale tips heavier dictates the entire cascade of biological events that follows.
Okay, let's make this really visceral for the listener because I love the analogy Jameson used in his 2012 paper in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. General. Picture yourself as a skier. You're standing at the absolute peak of a mountain and you're staring down a steep, icy, incredibly intimidating black diamond slope. The wind is howling, the drop-off is severe.
And the thing to remember here is the objective demands of that mountain are identical for anyone who stands at that peak. The steepness doesn't change based on who's looking at it. The ice doesn't change. The mountain is just an exceptionally high-demand environment.
But the internal equation is going to be radically different depending on who is strapped into those skis.
Yeah.
So imagine you're a complete novice. You've been on skis exactly twice in your entire life, and both times involve the bunny hill. Right, so in that moment, your brain is calculating the demands. Steep, icy, dangerous, and piling them incredibly high. Then it looks for your resources. And there are none. You don't have the muscle memory. You don't know how to carve an edge. You literally don't even know how to stop.
So the scale just slams down hard on the side of demands. Your resources are entirely insufficient. And when this happens, the biopsychosocial model states that you enter a threat state.
You're terrified.
Fundamentally terrified that you're going to fall and break your leg.
Yeah.
You just want to avoid the situation entirely.
Okay, now take that novice away and put an Olympic downhill skier at the top of that exact same icy slope.
The demand side of the scale is still high. It's still a dangerous, difficult mountain. But the Olympians' perceived resources side of the scale is massive. They have thousands of hours of training. They have elite core strength. They've navigated way worse conditions.
So their resources actually meet or even exceed the demands of the mountain.
Exactly. So the scale tips the other way. They enter a challenge state. They don't want to avoid the slope. They actually want to conquer it. They feel anticipation, excitement, and just a readiness to engage.
So the novice is in a threat state, and the Olympian is in a challenge state, which psychologically makes perfect sense. One is scared, one is pumped up. But what does that actually mean under the hood? I want to get into the biology here. Does the body physically know the difference between the two? Because if I'm the novice or the Olympian, my heart is going to be beating fast either way, right?
Oh, absolutely. Both individuals are going to experience a spike in heart rate. The moment you step to the edge of that slope, your sympathetic nervous system activates, specifically a pathway called the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, which we usually just call the SAM axis.
The SAM axis, okay.
The brain sends a signal down the spinal cord directly to the adrenal medulla, which sits right on top of your kidneys. And the adrenal medulla instantly pumps out catecholamines, primarily epinephrine, which is just the medical term for adrenaline.
So that adrenaline floods the bloodstream, hits the receptors in the heart, and tells the pacemaker cells to fire faster. Boom, boom.
Exactly. But that is where the similarities completely end. From the very moment that heart rate increases, the physiological paths of the challenge state and the threat state diverge so drastically, they almost look like two different species reacting to the world.
Wow. Okay, let's look at the Olympian first, the challenge state. Walk us through what is happening inside the Olympian's chest cavity.
So in a challenge state, your body is adopting what we call an approach orientation. Because your brain has appraised that you have the resources to handle this mountain, it decides to optimize your physical machinery for peak performance. It wants to give you everything you need to win. So not only does the heart beat faster, but it also pumps a significantly larger volume of blood with each individual beat.
Okay.
This is an increase in what we call cardiac output.
So the pump is basically working harder and moving more fluid.
Right. But if you just pump more fluid into a closed system of pipes, the pressure would skyrocket to dangerous levels. So the body does something brilliant. It dilates the blood vessels.
It opens them up.
Yes. The smooth muscle tissue lining your arteries actually relaxes, widening the diameter of the vessels.
Meaning there's less resistance for the blood to flow through.
Medically, we call this a decrease in total peripheral resistance, or TPR. So the pump is working at maximum efficiency, and the pipes are wide open. Highly oxygenated blood is rushing effortlessly to your skeletal muscles, so you can react quickly, and to your brain, so you can process the terrain at lightning speed.
And if you hooked the Olympian up to an electrocardiogram, you'd even see changes in the tiny electrical fractions of a second in the heartbeat, wouldn't you?
Oh, you would. You would see a decrease in the pre-ejection period, or PP is this tiny microscopic fraction of a second between the electrical spark that tells the heart's left ventricle to contract and the aortic valve actually popping open to eject the blood. In a challenge state, that electrical to mechanical delay shrinks. The engine is firing with zero lag. It perfectly mirrors the physiology of cardiovascular exercise. And beautifully, once the Olympian reaches the bottom of the mountain, the body clears the adrenaline and returns to a calm, homeostatic resting state really quickly.
That sounds incredible. I mean, that is the exact physiological state I want to be in when I'm stepping onto a stage to give a keynote address. Maximum oxygen to the brain, zero lag in the system, wide open blood vessels. But let's look at the dark side of the coin here. What's happening to the novice skier? What does the threat state do to the body?
Well, the threat state represents an avoidance or really a damage control orientation. The subconscious equation has determined that you do not have the resources to survive this mountain. You're going to fail, and you're likely going to suffer physical damage.
Yikes.
So the body prepares for defeat. Alongside that initial hit of adrenaline from the SAM axis, the threat state heavily activates a secondary slower stress system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis.
And the HPA axis is the pathway that ends with the release of cortisol, right? The famous or maybe infamous stress hormone.
Yeah, cortisol gets a really bad reputation.
Yeah.
But it's just doing what it evolved to do.
Yeah.
In a threat state, the activation of the HPA axis essentially tempers and alters the beneficial effects of the adrenaline. So your heart rate goes up, but your cardiac output does not significantly increase.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The heart is beating frantically, fast and shallow, but it isn't actually moving a greater volume of blood per minute.
So the pump is just spinning its wheels.
Exactly. And the most dramatic destructive difference is what happens to the pipes. Instead of dilating, the blood vessels constrict. The smooth muscles tighten.
Total peripheral resistance goes through the roof.
The vascular system literally clamps down. And the reason for this goes right back to our evolutionary hangover. If you're a hunter-gatherer facing a massive predator and your brain calculates that you're going to lose the fight, it anticipates that you are going to be bitten, scratched, or gored.
Oh, wow.
Right. By constricting the peripheral blood vessels in your arms and legs, the body is trying to minimize blood loss. It's basically a biological tourniquet, trying to keep the blood localized in your deep core to keep your organs alive while you bleed.
That is wild. So when you're standing outside the boardroom and your hands feel ice cold, that isn't just a metaphor. Your hands are physically cold because your brain has triggered a threat state and your body is clamping down the blood vessels in your extremities so you don't bleed to death when the CEO critiques your quarterly earnings report.
Exactly. It is a profound mismatch of biology and environment. In a modern context, taking a standardized test or navigating a difficult meeting does not carry the risk of physical laceration. But because the body is using that ancient hardware, that vasoconstriction is completely maladaptive.
Because it's cutting off the blood to the brain.
Yes. By clamping down those blood vessels, you are actively limiting the flow of highly oxygenated blood to your prefrontal cortex right at the exact moment. You need complex problem-solving skills to answer the CEO's questions.
And to make matters worse, doesn't a threat state linger far longer than a challenge state?
It does. Adrenaline clears the system relatively quickly.
Yeah.
But cortisol has a much longer half-life in the bloodstream. A threat state lingers. The feeling of anxiety, the constricted chest, the shallow breathing, the recovery back to a normal resting state is slow, protracted, and really exhausting.
Okay, let's just pause and really cement what we just established, because this is huge. Our subconscious appraisal, a purely psychological belief about whether we have the skills to handle a presentation, literally dictates the physical diameter of our blood vessels.
Yes.
It dictates the electrical timing of our heart valves. It dictates whether our brain gets a flood of oxygen to solve a complex problem, or whether we're starved of oxygen because our body thinks a tiger is about to rip our arm off.
It perfectly illustrates that the mind and the body are not two separate entities. They are a single continuous feedback loop, which sets up the next crucial layer of this deep dive. We know the heart and the blood vessels are doing the mechanical work, but the heart is just a dumb pump.
Right.
It only does what the central nervous system commands it to do.
Right.
So where exactly is this appraisal happening? How does a psychological perception of a spreadsheet take over our entire neural architecture?
We need to go inside the skull. Which brings us to the neuroscience of the stress shift. and how our brain literally reconfigures its large-scale networks when that adrenaline hits.
Right. And to understand this architectural shift, we lean on some brilliant research spearheaded by Erno Hermans and his colleagues. They published a landmark paper in the journal Science back in 2011 and followed it up with an incredibly detailed review in Trends in Cognitive Sciences in 2014.
Okay.
Hermans argued that if we want to understand stress, we cannot just look at isolated tiny brain regions. We have to look at how entire massive networks of regions communicate with one another.
Yeah, reading through Herman's 2014 paper, Dynamic Adaptation of Large-Scale Brain Networks in Response to Acute Stressors, it genuinely feels like watching a military general completely change their battle plan in the middle of a war. The brain engages in this massive, sweeping reallocation of resources. Can you walk us through the mechanics of this dual network shift?
Absolutely. The catalyst for this entire shift originates deep in the brainstem in this tiny cluster of neurons called the locus coeruleus.
The locus coeruleus.
Yes. It's essentially the brain's emergency dispatch center. When an acute stressor hits, when you open the door to the boardroom and see everyone staring at you, the locus coeruleus fires, sending a massive surge of catecholamines, primarily noradrenaline, washing over the entire brain.
And noradrenaline acts like a system-wide alarm bell.
It acts as an incredibly potent neuromodulator. And what it does is trigger a profound shift in the balance of power between two major competing brain networks. The first network, which is immediately hyperactivated by this noradrenaline flood, is the salience network.
The salience network. What regions are involved in this, and what is its actual job?
So the salience network includes regions deep in the older parts of the brain. The amygdala, which acts as the threat detection center, the anterior insula, which monitors your internal bodily sensations, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus.
That's a lot of regions.
It is. And when that noradrenaline hits, these regions suddenly start talking to each other rapidly, continuously, and intensely. They form a high-speed communication loop.
It's like the military suddenly switching to a secure, high-priority radio channel.
Exactly. The sole job of the salience network is survival. It promotes fear, hypervigilance, and rapid autonomic control. It wildly scans the environment for threats. It's what makes you notice the slight frown on your boss's face or the shifting body language of a client. It mobilizes the body's energy resources, sending signals down to the adrenal glands to keep pumping. It's the act now, think later network.
But the human brain operates on a strict, finite energy budget, doesn't it? It only has so much glucose and oxygen to go around. If the locus coeruleus is massively upregulating the salience network and demanding huge amounts of energy for the amygdala and the insula, that energy has to be stolen from somewhere else.
And this is exactly where the cognitive cost of stress becomes apparent. Simultaneously, as the salience network surges in power, higher-order cognitive functions are actively suppressed. The brain pulls resources away from the executive control network.
The executive control network. This is the part of the brain that makes us uniquely human, right? This includes the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC.
Yes, the DLPFC sits right behind your forehead. It is basically the CEO of the brain. It's responsible for working memory, slow, deliberate thinking, complex problem solving, impulse control, and cognitive flexibility.
So it's the part of the brain that allows you to hold 3 different ideas in your head at once and synthesize them.
Right. So the noradrenaline surge actively starves the CEO of resources. It impairs the executive control network to feed the salience network. This is the exact biological mechanism behind why, under extreme stress, you might completely blank on a speech you have rehearsed 100 times in your living room.
Oh, wow.
It's why a relatively simple math problem suddenly looks like ancient hieroglyphics during a final exam. Your working memory is literally degrading because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does not have the blood flow or the neurochemical support to function. The amygdala has taken over the steering wheel.
You know, when you first hear that explanation that stress actively suppresses the prefrontal cortex, it sounds like a catastrophic design flaw.
Yeah.
Like, why would human biology evolve to make us dumber in the exact moments we face a crisis?
It really does seem counterintuitive.
But looking at Herman's work, you realize it's actually an incredibly elegant design.
Taking that evolutionary perspective is essential here. Put yourself back on the savannah. You're foraging for food, perhaps engaging in some slow, deliberate tool-making, which is using your executive control network.
Right. And suddenly, a leopard jumps out of the tall grass. In that millisecond, you do not need to perform complex arithmetic. You do not need to philosophize about the trajectory of the leopard's leap or debate the moral implications of predator-prey dynamics in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
You need to run, or you need to find a heavy rock immediately.
Exactly. You need the salience network to flood your system with pure, unfiltered vigilance, fear, and physical readiness. Suppressing the slow, deliberative, executive network in favor of the rapid, reactive salience network isn't a flaw. It is the ultimate survival mechanism. The problem isn't the hardware. The problem is that we are triggering the leopard response when we're asked to read a quarterly earnings report.
But the shift to the salience network is only phase one of the timeline, right? This is where the story gets incredibly strange and honestly a bit counterintuitive, because Herman's 2014 paper points out that there's a second phase to this network reconfiguration driven by a hormone we usually associate with making things worse, the cortisol rebound. Yes, it is entirely counterintuitive based on pop psychology. We mentioned earlier that the locus coeruleus pumps out noradrenaline almost instantly. It's the lightning strike.
Yeah.
But the HPA axis, the system that releases cortisol, is slower. Cortisol is a heavy steroid hormone.
Right.
It takes time to synthesize and travel through the bloodstream. It usually doesn't peak until about 20 to 30 minutes after the initial stressor begins.
So the adrenaline has already caused the chaos, and then half an hour later, the cortisol finally arrives. I've always been told cortisol is the bad guy. If it arrives 30 minutes later, doesn't it just prolong the anxiety?
Well, in chronic situations, yes, which we'll discuss later. But in an acute single stress event, cortisol's role in the brain is actually fascinating. When it reaches the brain, cortisol binds to specific receptors called glucocorticoid receptors, or GR, which are highly concentrated in the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
And over the course of the next hour, this slow-acting hormone actually initiates a reversal of the network balance.
Wait, so the stress hormone is the thing that turns the cognitive CEO back on?
Precisely. Cortisol acts like the biological cleanup crew. It binds to the prefrontal cortex and slowly begins to suppress the salience network. It tells the amygdala and the insula to quiet down, the threat is past. And simultaneously, it actively upregulates the executive control network, bringing blood flow and connectivity back to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to restore homeostasis.
But why the delay? Like, why does the brain need a massive spike of fear followed by a slow return to deep cognitive control?
Because of memory consolidation. The brain wants you to survive the immediate threat using the salience network. But once you are safe, the brain desperately wants you to learn from the experience so you don't get eaten next time.
Ah, that makes sense.
The late-phase activation of the executive control network, driven by cortisol, is vital for deeply encoding the memory of the stressful event. The stress response is beautifully biphasic. A rapid noradrenaline-driven shift to the salience network for immediate survival, followed by a slower cortisol-driven shift back to the executive control network for recovery, analysis, and learning.
The engineering of the human brain is just phenomenal. But this brings up a massive nuance that we really need to explore. We know the brain shifts these large-scale networks when a threat appears. But as we established with the skier analogy, we aren't all facing objective leopards. We're facing highly subjective perceptions of threat. So the question is, how does an individual's unique psychological perception of a threat actually alter the physical wiring and communication between specific brain regions?
To answer that, we have to look at how different brain regions couple together. And a brilliant study to illuminate this was published in 2011 by Wingen and colleagues in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. The title of the paper tells you exactly where they're going. Perceived threat predicts the neural sequelae of combat stress.
Wow. So they didn't just look at people taking a math test. They went to the absolute extreme end of the human stress spectrum, military combat.
Yeah, Wingen and his team conducted a remarkable prospective study. They recruited a group of healthy soldiers and put them inside an fMRI scanner before they deployed to an active combat zone in Afghanistan.
To get a baseline.
Exactly. They measured their baseline brain activity and connectivity. Then, after the soldiers completed their deployment and returned home, they put them back into the fMRI scanner.
Because they wanted to see how months of severe life-or-death stress, actual objective combat exposure, altered the functioning of the fear centers, specifically the amygdala.
Right. And when they looked at the overall group data, simply comparing pre-deployment to post-deployment, they found what you might expect. Across the board, actual combat exposure increased general amygdala and insular reactivity to biologically salient stimuli, meaning After deployment, their threat detection centers were generally more sensitive and reactive.
So just being in the environment objectively raised the baseline reactivity of the alarm system.
Yes, the objective exposure matters for baseline sensitivity.
Mhm.
And this is the turning point that reshaped how we view trauma and stress. When the researchers looked at functional connectivity, the entire story changed.
Let's define functional connectivity really quickly for the listener. We aren't just talking about a brain region lighting up. We're talking about how perfectly synchronized the firing is between two different regions, like how closely they are talking to each other.
Exactly. It's the communication pathway, the coupling.
Yeah.
Wingen specifically look at the communication between the amygdala, which is the gas pedal for fear, and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC, which in this context acts as a regulatory brake pedal.
Okay.
Usually in a healthy brain, these two regions have a strong negative coupling. When the regulatory prefrontal regions are highly active, they suppress and quiet down the amygdala. The brake pedal overrides the gas pedal.
So what happened to that brake line after combat?
What Wingen found was that changes in this critical regulatory pathway did not correlate with the objective amount of combat the soldiers saw. You could have two soldiers in the exact same vehicle, enduring the exact same firefight. The objective stressor was identical. But the degradation of the brain's regulatory connectivity depended entirely on the perceived threat reported by the individual soldier.
Wait, let me make sure I'm fully wrapping my head around this. The physical wiring of the brain's ability to calm itself down was dictated not by the bullets flying outside the vehicle, but by the internal narrative the soldier was experiencing about the bullets.
That is exactly what the data showed.
Yeah.
Individuals who perceived a high level of threat during their deployment showed significantly reduced negative coupling between the amygdala and the prefrontal regulatory regions.
Wow.
The communication pathway was weakened. Their brain's ability to apply the cognitive brakes to their fear center was fundamentally compromised. Conversely, soldiers who experienced the same combat but perceived a lower level of personal threat actually showed enhanced negative coupling. Their regulatory control over the amygdala got stronger. They wired their brains for resilience.
That is staggering. The psychological appraisal dictates the neuroplasticity.
And Wingen found one more crucial detail. For those who perceived high threat, not only did the brake pedal get weaker, but the coupling between the amygdala and the insula got stronger. Remember, the insula is deeply involved in interoception, the awareness of internal bodily states, like feeling your heart racing or your chest tightening.
Right.
So high perceived threat literally wires the brain to be more acutely physically aware of the physical sensations of fear, while simultaneously severing the brain's ability to logically regulate that fear. It is a biological recipe for trauma, driven by perception.
Obviously, a combat zone is the most extreme crucible for this mechanism. But this wiring process isn't isolated to war zones, right? The exact same coupling mechanisms are happening to us in the civilian world, usually driven by what psychologists call social evaluative threat, or SET.
This is incredibly relevant to the listener. Most of the intense stressors you and I face on a daily basis are not physical predators or combat scenarios. They're purely social. Public speaking, sitting down for a job interview, raising your hand in a crowded lecture hall, anticipating judgment from your peers.
Because evolutionarily, being judged and rejected by the tribe meant exile and starvation. So the brain treats social evaluation as a life or death scenario.
To understand the physical impact of that, we can look at a brilliant manuscript published in 2009 in Neuroimage by Tor Wager and his colleagues. They wanted to map exactly how the fear of being judged changes the rhythm of our heart.
How to do that?
Wager used fMRI to monitor the brain while participants underwent a social evaluative threat. And they found that during these moments of perceived social stress, there is a massive spike in activity in the DACC. And as we mentioned earlier, when the DACC fires up as part of the salience network, it drives sympathetic nervous system arousal. It sends the signal down the spinal cord to spike the heart rate.
So worrying about what the audience thinks of my shirt literally sends an electrical spike to my heart muscle?
Yes. But at the exact same time the DACC is hitting the gas pedal, Wager observed a profound decrease in activity in two other regions: the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, and the medial orbitofrontal cortex, the MOFC.
And what do the VMPFC and MOFC normally do?
Those are your calming centers. They're deeply associated with parasympathetic activation, the rest and digest system that slows the heart down and relaxes the body. So social evaluative threat is a double whammy. It hits the gas pedal in the DACC, and it takes the foot completely off the brakes in the VMPFC.
And the connection from the brain to the heart goes through a very specific relay station, right?
Yes. Wager identified that an ancient area deep in the brainstem called the periaqueductal gray, or PEI, acts as the direct relay, linking these cortical brain regions to the heart rate changes. But the monumental insight from Wager's study was the trigger.
What triggered it?
The coupling between the prefrontal cortex, the PEI, and the heart is driven purely by the conceptual appraisal of the threat. It is the mere idea that you are being judged negatively. There's no physical stimulus. The concept of judgment alters the VMPFC, which signals the PEG, which spikes your heart rate to 120 beats per minute.
Okay, this brings us to a massive crossroads in our understanding. We've established that acute stress causes a noradrenaline flood that shuts down the executive control network. We've established that perceiving a threat reduces our brain's regulatory connectivity, weakening our cognitive brakes.
What?
If stress literally suppresses the prefrontal cortex, the exact part of the brain we need to think clearly, to speak eloquently, to remember data, how do high performers ever exist? How do airline pilots handle engine failures? How do surgeons operate under pressure? If the biology demands that we get dumber under stress, how do people ever perform well?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? If the biological default is cognitive degradation, how do we override it? The key lies in the brain's incredible capacity for active cognitive control and how it can forcefully reallocate resources under extreme mental workload.
To crack this open, let's look at an absolutely fascinating fMRI study published in 2021 by Mikkel Koss and his team in the journal Brain and Behavior. They set out to see what happens to the brain when you combine a profoundly difficult cognitive task with severe, highly distracting acute stress.
The methodology of this study is wonderfully diabolical. They put participants inside an fMRI scanner, which is already a loud, claustrophobic environment, and had them perform what is known as an end-back task.
Explain the end-back task, because it is notoriously frustrating even when you're completely relaxed.
It's a brutal test of working memory. Imagine a screen flashing letters one at a time. A, F, K, F. You have to press a button only when the current letter matches the letter you saw 2 steps back.
Okay, already stressed.
Right. So when this second F appears, you have to remember that you saw an F 2 letters ago, while simultaneously updating your memory to remember the K for the next step. It requires intense, continuous focus and taxes the executive control network to its absolute limit.
So they're doing this brutal memory task inside the scanner. But Cause didn't stop there. To induce a state of acute stress, they didn't just let them focus. They informed the participants that while they were trying to remember the letters, they would be subjected to random, incredibly loud, highly aversive auditory alarms blasted directly into their ears.
Yeah, so you're trying to juggle complex variables in your mind, and at any unpredictable second, a terrifying siren might go off. The salience network should be screaming. The amygdala should be demanding all the brain's energy to monitor the terrifying noises.
The natural hypothesis here is that the participants' performance on the end-back task should have completely cratered. High cognitive load plus severe acute stress should equal complete executive control network failure. But when Cause looked at the results, that is not what happened at all.
The performance did not decrease. The participants managed to maintain their accuracy on the memory task despite the blaring alarms, and the fMRI scans revealed how they pulled off this miraculous feat.
What did they do?
The brain actively recruited extraneural resources. To maintain performance, the brain hyperactivated regions within the executive control network, specifically the lateral frontoparietal regions, pulling in backup processing power to compensate for the stress strain.
So the brain was just redlining the engine to keep the memory task running, but how did it deal with the sirens? Because you can't just ignore a blaring alarm. The auditory cortex is hardwired to process loud sounds.
This is the most staggering finding of the Cause study. The scans revealed a massive active deactivation in a region called the superior temporal gyri, or the STG.
The STG.
Yes, the STG is the primary auditory cortex. It's the part of the brain that processes sound. To protect the executive control network from being overwhelmed, the brain actively, literally suppressed its own hearing centers to filter out the aversive noises.
I want the listener to really visualize this. Your brain can literally put biological noise-canceling headphones on your auditory cortex so your prefrontal cortex can finish its math problem.
That is precisely what is happening. The brain recognizes that the noise, while terrifying, is not lethal, and the task at hand is the priority. Furthermore, when Cause ran a functional connectivity analysis, he found that the brain was utilizing intense top-down control.
From the CEO.
Exactly. The dorsal, medial, prefrontal, and parietal regions were sending signals down into the limbic system, actively deactivating the amygdala and the hippocampus. The CEO of the brain was looking at the alarm system and saying, I know you are terrified of the sirens, but I am shutting off your power supply so we can finish this end-back task.
So high performance under pressure is not about a magical absence of stress. It is not about feeling perfectly calm. It's about the brain's incredible ability to exert intense, energy-demanding, top-down regulation to inhibit sensory processing and emotional fear while hyperactivating working memory.
It is an active, brutal battle for resources, and in this case, the executive control network won by suppressing the senses. But there's a massive catch.
Your battery drain.
Exactly. Imagine how much cellular energy it takes to actively suppress your own auditory cortex while simultaneously hyperactivating your working memory under the flood of noradrenaline. It is an immense metabolic load, which is why this kind of top-down suppression is strictly a short-term solution. It is not sustainable over days, weeks, or months.
Which provides the perfect transition to a critical distinction we must make. Everything we've talked about so far, the skier, the public speaker, the end-back task, these are acute stressors. They happen, the biological cascade triggers, and then the event ends. But what happens when the event never ends? What happens when you were trapped in a threat state for years?
To understand the dark side of this biology, we look to a comprehensive 2018 review published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience by Godoy and colleagues, titled A Comprehensive Overview on Stress Neurobiology. Godoy masterfully lays out the physiological divide between acute challenge and chronic threat. Acute stress is adaptive. As cause proved, your brain can marshal the metabolic resources to conquer it. But chronic psychological stress, being in a constant state of threat appraisal day after day due to a toxic workplace, financial ruin, or domestic instability, is devastating to the physical architecture of the brain.
When you say physical architecture, we're not just talking about feeling burned out or emotionally exhausted, right? We're talking about literal structural changes to the gray matter.
We are talking about the physical rewiring of the brain's hardware. Godoy's review highlights that chronic stress leads to progressive dendritic loss in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus.
Let's visualize that. A neuron looks a bit like a tree. It has a trunk, and it has branches called dendrites that reach out to connect and communicate with other neurons. What does dendritic loss actually mean?
It means the branches are literally shrinking, withering away, and retracting. The density of the connections drops. Because the brain is bathed in a chronic, never-ending trickle of cortisol, the areas responsible for cognitive control, emotional regulation, and memory formation physically atrophy. The prefrontal cortex shrinks.
The CEO's office gets smaller and loses its phone lines. But it's not just shrinking everywhere, right? Some parts of the brain actually grow under chronic stress.
This is the cruelest irony of chronic stress. While the regulatory centers wither, Godoy notes that chronic stress causes hypertrophy and overgrowth of dendritic density in the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens.
The branches in the fear center are getting thicker, more dense, and more highly connected.
Yes. The fear center is getting bigger and stronger, while the reasoning center is shrinking and getting weaker. Chronic threat literally wires the brain for anxiety. It locks the individual into a permanent biological state where the salience network dominates.
So they can't turn it off.
No. They become hyper-reactive to incredibly minor daily stressors, a dropped fork, an unreturned email because their enlarged amygdala requires very little stimulation to fire, and their shrunken prefrontal cortex lacks the density to apply the brakes. It impairs their ability to learn, to exert cognitive flexibility, or to see a way out of their situation. It is a self-perpetuating biological cycle.
Which makes the final section of our deep dive the absolute most important part of this entire discussion. We've seen the stakes. We know that a challenge state gives us cardiovascular efficiency, approach motivation, and a rapid return to homeostasis. We know that a threat state restricts our blood flow, floods us with cortisol, and if it becomes chronic, literally prunes the branches off our prefrontal cortex.
Right.
So how do we intervene? How do we hack the equation of demands versus resources? If I'm standing outside that boardroom door, how do I force my brain into a challenge state?
This is where the science pivots from diagnostic to highly prescriptive. The research on intervening in the stress response is incredibly robust, and it centers on hacking our appraisals and our mindsets. We have 3 major transformative studies to explore here.
Let's start with an intervention called arousal reappraisal, returning to the work of Jeremy Jameson and colleagues, specifically a brilliant 2012 paper titled Mind Over Matter, Reappraising Arousal Improves Cardiovascular and Cognitive Responses to Stress.
Okay, so let's put the listener back in the scenario. You're about to take a high-stakes, standardized test or give a massive public speech. Your heart is racing at 110 beats per minute, your palms are sweaty, your stomach is flipping. What is the conventional wisdom? What does every well-meaning friend, teacher, or parent tell you to do in that exact moment?
They tell you to take a deep breath and try to calm down.
Which, based on everything we've discussed about the SAM axis and noradrenaline, is terrible, physiologically impossible advice.
It's fighting against a biological tidal wave.
Exactly. You are flooded with epinephrine. Your locus coeruleus has sounded the alarm. Trying to consciously tell your cardiovascular system to just turn off the adrenaline is like trying to stop a runaway freight train by holding up a feather. It doesn't work.
And what's worse, when you try to calm down and inevitably fail because your heart is still pounding, you appraise that failure as evidence that you are fundamentally terrified. You think, I can't even control my own breathing. I am definitely going to bomb this speech.
Yes. By trying to calm down, you actually increase your perceived demands, tipping the internal scale even further into a threat state.
So Jameson took a completely different approach. He utilized a biopsychosocial intervention called arousal reappraisal. In a series of double-blind laboratory studies, researchers brought participants in and told them they were going to perform a highly stressful social evaluative task, like public speaking in front of judges, followed by complex mental math.
A nightmare.
Yeah, totally. But instead of telling the intervention group to calm down, the researchers gave them a short script that entirely reframed the meaning of their physical arousal.
They changed the story. What did they tell them?
They instructed the participants, in a few moments, your heart is going to race, your breathing will quicken, and your palms will sweat. Do not view this as anxiety. This physical response is your body mobilizing its resources to help you perform. That pounding heart is pumping highly oxygenated blood to your brain so you can think faster. That rapid breathing is increasing your stamina. Your body is giving you the tools you need to succeed.
They literally told them to take the physical sensations of stress and move them from the demand side of the BPS scale over to the resources side. The arousal itself became the weapon to conquer the task. What were the results?
The physiological data was stunning. Participants who were instructed to reappraise their arousal as functional exhibited classic challenge state cardiovascular responses. When hooked up to monitors, they showed significantly lower total peripheral vascular resistance.
Their blood vessels dilated instead of constricting. Their bodies believed the news story.
They believed the story down to the endothelial cells lining their arteries. They showed increased cardiac efficiency. The pump moved more blood with less resistance. But the benefits weren't just in the chest cavity. They altered cognitive processing. The reappraisal group showed reduced attentional bias to negative cues.
Meaning they weren't scanning the faces of the judges looking for frowns or signs of failure. Their salience network wasn't obsessing over threat.
Exactly. And the most pragmatic outcome of all, they actually scored higher on the objective cognitive tests. Simply reframing the meaning of their pounding heart improved their working memory and cognitive performance. They hacked their cardiovascular system using nothing but a conceptual reinterpretation.
That is an incredibly powerful tool you can use tomorrow morning. When the heart rate spikes, you greet it. You say, thank you for the fuel. But the research goes even deeper than in-the-moment localized reappraisal. It's also about your overarching global worldview of yourself. Which brings us to the second intervention, implicit theories of personality.
This broadens the scope significantly. We are looking at a fantastic 2016 study published in Psychological Science by David Yeager, Jeremy Jameson, and Hai-Yen Lee, titled How to Improve Adolescent Stress Responses. They wanted to see if altering a fundamental, foundational belief about human nature could buffer teenagers against the crushing weight of social stress.
Because if we're honest, high school is basically a 4-year-long, unconsenting social evaluative threat experiment. The fear of peer judgment is at its absolute lifetime peak.
It's the perfect laboratory for studying social stress. Yeager focused on what psychologists call implicit theories of personality. Simply put, do you believe people can change? Some individuals hold what is called an entity theory. They believe that people's traits, their intelligence, their awkwardness, their social skills are fixed, permanent entities that cannot be altered.
If you hold an entity theory and you face a massive social exclusion, say, you get mocked in front of the entire cafeteria, you appraise that event not just as a bad day, but as a permanent, indelible diagnosis of your fixed, deficient identity. It is an unchangeable, massive demand on this scale.
It is a permanent threat to your social survival. But other individuals hold an incremental theory. They believe that personality traits, social skills, and intelligence are malleable. They can incrementally change and grow through effort and experience.
Okay.
Yeager and his team designed a remarkably brief intervention, a reading and writing exercise, to teach ninth graders this incremental theory. They taught them the neuroscience of neuroplasticity. They taught them that the brain can grow, that people have the potential to change, and that being excluded or rejected is a temporary event, not a permanent mark of deficiency.
And after teaching them this, they put them through a brutal laboratory stressor to see if the biology had shifted. They used the Trier Social Stress Test, or the TSST.
The TSST is the gold standard for inducing acute social stress in a laboratory. It is diabolical.
It really is.
The participant is brought into a room and told they have 5 minutes to prepare a speech about their personal strengths and weaknesses, or in this case, a speech about what makes people popular. Then they have to deliver that speech to a panel of judges. But these are not normal judges. They are actors trained to maintain completely flat, unsmiling, slightly disapproving facial expressions. They do not nod, they do not encourage, they just stare.
And if you finish early, they just sit there in dead silence for 20 seconds before telling you, "You still have time remaining, please continue." It's agonizing. And then they make you do complex mental math out loud, and if you make a mistake, they make you start over from the beginning.
It's designed to maximize social evaluative threat. And yet, the adolescents who had received the brief incremental theory intervention showed remarkably different biological responses compared to the control group. Because they had internalized the belief that their personality could grow, they did not view the unsmiling judges as a permanent, fixed threat to their identity. Their appraisal of the situation's demands decreased, and their perceived resources, their ability to grow past the event, increased.
How did that mindset shift show up in the blood work and the cardiovascular monitors?
The intervention group exhibited highly adaptive cardiovascular responses. Their vascular resistance stayed low. Crucially, they showed significantly lower acute cortisol reactivity. Their HPA axis did not panic. The slow-acting stress hormone was kept in check. Furthermore, they recovered to baseline resting heart rate much faster after the brutal TSST ended.
But what makes Yeager's study a masterpiece is that he didn't stop in the artificial environment of the lab. He followed these teenagers out into the real world. They ran a daily diary study tracking the students' stress over the course of the actual school year.
Yes, this is where the translation to real life is proven. Over the subsequent months, on days where the students reported high levels of daily social stress fights with friends, bad grades, cafeteria drama, the students who learned the incremental theory did not show the typical biological spikes in threat appraisals and cortisol that the control group showed.
By altering a core belief about human malleability, the intervention literally severed the biological link between daily social friction and toxic neuroendocrine responses.
It protected their biology and the downstream effect of protecting that biology. Over the course of their freshman year, the intervention group actually earned higher GPAs than the control group. Their prefrontal cortexes weren't being shrunk by chronic cortisol, so they could actually learn.
A 30-minute reading and writing exercise about the ability for human beings to change literally lowered their cortisol levels months later, prevented vascular constriction, and improved their grades. That is the sheer power of a foundational mindset, which brings us perfectly to our final piece of the puzzle. A study from Aliyah Crum and her colleagues in 2017, published in Anxiety, Stress, and Coping.
Okay, let's dive into Crum's work.
Crum's work on stress mindsets beautifully synthesizes every single mechanism we've discussed today. She categorizes human mindsets regarding stress into two fundamental camps. The first is the stress is debilitating mindset. This is the assumption that stress is inherently toxic, damaging to performance, and must be avoided at all costs.
And let's be honest, based on how the media, wellness influencers, and even some doctors talk about stress, 99% of the population holds the debilitating mindset. We treat stress like an infectious disease.
We really do. But Crum identified a second camp, the stress is enhancing mindset. This is the belief that experiencing stress is actually a necessary catalyst for growth, that it improves performance, hones focus, and facilitates deep learning.
Crum wanted to see if she could shift people into that enhancing mindset and what the biological consequences of that shift would be.
Exactly. Crum demonstrated that simply orienting individuals toward a stress-enhancing mindset using short, targeted multimedia film clips fundamentally changed their physiological and cognitive reactions to a subsequent severe social stress test.
Let me push back on that slightly. Even if the stressor they faced was objectively threatening, even if they were facing the unsmiling judges from the TSST.
Yes. The beauty of Crumb's findings is that the global mindset overrode the specific situational appraisal. Regardless of whether the participant initially appraised the specific speech task as a challenge or a threat, simply having a foundational stresses-enhancing mindset produced sharper increases in anabolic hormones relative to the debilitating mindset group.
Anabolic hormones, let's define that, because usually we hear about catabolic hormones like cortisol, which break tissues down.
Anabolic hormones, like DHEA, are the hormones related to cellular growth, tissue repair, and neurogenesis. They are the building blocks. When you hold an enhancing mindset, the stress response actually triggers the release of hormones that build the brain and body back stronger than they were before the stressor.
That's amazing.
Furthermore, when the task was appraised as a challenge, the enhancing mindset produced sharper increases in positive affect, a heightened attentional bias toward positive stimuli, meaning they look for smiling faces rather than frowning ones, and much greater cognitive flexibility.
To bring this all together, the enhancing mindset fundamentally changes the actual end-state goal of stress regulation. If you have a debilitating mindset, your goal is to avoid stress. But avoidance is the core mechanism of the threat state. Avoidance triggers the HPA axis. Avoidance constricts your blood vessels.
Avoidance bathes your brain in cortisol.
Right, and shrinks the dendrites in your prefrontal cortex. By trying to avoid stress, you are biologically destroying your ability to handle it.
That is the ultimate paradox.
Yeah.
But if your goal shifts, if you seek to actively utilize stress, everything changes. The physiological arousal, the noradrenaline flooding from the locus coeruleus, the pounding heart, the sweating palms, they cease to be symptoms of failure. They become high-octane tools.
You lean into this sensation.
And your brain's architecture effortlessly supports that approach motivation. It opens the blood vessels, it increases cardiac output, it recruits the lateral frontoparietal networks to maintain working memory, it suppresses the auditory distractions, and allows you to perform at the absolute peak of your human potential.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and synthesize this massive, incredibly dense journey we just went on. We started at the very foundation, the biopsychosocial model. We established that an incredibly fast subconscious scale, weighing demands against resources, dictates our entire physical reality. If demands win, we fall into a threat state, the HPA axis activates, cortisol floods the system, our blood vessels painfully constrict, and our heart spins its wheels in anticipation of defeat.
But if resources win, we enter a challenge state. The SAM axis gives us that clean, potent adrenaline, our blood vessels dilate to maximum capacity, and our heart pumps oxygenated blood with incredible lag-free efficiency.
From that cardiovascular foundation, we zoomed deep into the brainstem, witnessing the noradrenaline-fueled shifts between the rapid hypervigilant salience network and the slow, deliberate executive control network. We saw how the perception of threat literally alters the functional connectivity of our amygdala, severing the regulatory brake lines of our prefrontal cortex.
We looked unflinchingly at the dangers of chronic threat, the literal shrinking of the dendritic branches in our memory centers, while the fear center grows out of control. But counterbalancing that, we saw the awe-inspiring resilience of the human brain, its ability to actively put noise-canceling headphones on the auditory cortex to maintain intense cognitive control under the most severe pressure.
And finally, we explored the empirical science of intervention. We examined arousal reappraisal, the power of implicit theories of personality, and the biological shifts driven by a stresses-enhancing mindset. The scientific literature proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you can consciously, deliberately hack your appraisal system to transform your biological response.
Which brings us back to where we started. Standing outside that door, hand hovering over the knob. The physiological response to stress isn't a life sentence. It is not an unchangeable, rigid biological reflex. It is a highly malleable, dynamic, beautifully adaptive system that responds directly to your internal narrative.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, empowering challenge. The next time you are standing outside that boardroom, the next time you feel your heart pounding against your ribs, your breathing gets shallow, and your palms get sweaty before a high-stakes moment, do not tell yourself to calm down. Ask yourself, what if my body is just giving me the exact high-octane fuel I need to conquer this mountain? What if this adrenaline isn't a threat, but an invitation to grow?
It's a simple question, but it's a question that just might change the physical architecture of your biology.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.